This week's show brought to you by the end of the NBA season. Aw, man. Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks show. End of the regular season, Brian, and it all comes down to this. The Boxscore Geeks portfolio hinges on how some of the games go tonight between whether or not will be a failure or a treadmill team failure.
You want to just hit that at the beginning of the show, Dre? Might as well.
Yeah, we'll go into so I'll do the brief intro. My name is Dre Alvarez, a.k.a. Nerd Numbers. With me, as always, co-host, voice of God, producer, scriptwriter, man of many hats, Brian Foster. You can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Already said hey, but say hey again, Brian.
Yeah, I guess we got to do introductions. So, yeah, let's get into it. Let's do it.
All right, so basically, we're probably going to go over maybe the playoffs a little again, some of the stuff there. We got some defense, some top 10 box scores, et cetera. But the very first thing we kind of want to get to is just keeping you cognizant. Wasn't as big of a feature this year, in part just because of busyness. As I've mentioned, Brian kept, myself and Patrick on our toes. But, obviously our content has not been as much as in previous seasons. But an annual tradition of the Boxscore Geeks is that preseason, Patrick goes down to Las Vegas, puts his money where his mouth is in terms of what he thinks about the state of the NBA, and we'll see what happens at the end of the regular season. So we've got a lot of bets that kind of ride on tonight. For instance, Golden State winning more than 66 games. We kind of figure out if that happens tonight. Boston is under 52. We might just barely. We're gonna get that for sure, which is awesome actually. So there are a bunch of bets that are kind of hanging in the balance as of tonight. We're not going to talk too much in depth because, as Brian noted, we wanted Patrick to talk. Because Patrick will probably do a follow-up article. Chicago winning over 40. Here's what I just want to give the brief PSA on this, Brian, before we kind of move on. At the start of the season, it's easy to say a lot of things in terms of confidence. So, for instance, one thing that I was very confident on, not in terms of his ability, but just in terms of the outcome, I said James Harden had no shot at the MVP, in part because I didn't think the Houston Rockets were going to be a 50-plus win team. I thought James Harden is MVP caliber, but the loss of Dwight Howard, picking up Ryan Anderson and Eric Gordon, last season they were a 40s team. Even if James Harden bounced back, that's maybe high 40s. And then, of course, with D'Antoni, James Harden being the point guard, Trevor Ariza, remembering he's Trevor Ariza, this team bounces back.
That was a big part of it that people forget is Ariza.
Yeah, I mean, basically what happened is D'Antoni comes in and, Beverly Ariza and James Harden, maybe that's just D'Antoni's skill. He basically comes up to guards and guard forwards and is like, go. And they did. Those three players came back in a big way. Clint Capella, progressed like we would expect. The players that we thought were crappy pickups were crappy pickups, but those three guys playing as well as they did boosted this team into the 50-win range. And now I thought James Harden was the favorite for MVP. So it's really easy at the start of the season to say stuff confidently and then just be wrong as the season goes on because it's really, really hard to predict. As an example, Russell Westbrook being the MVP. Bullshit if at the start of the season anybody said Russell Westbrook is going to beat Oscar Robertson's 41 triple-doubles in a season and average a triple-double for the season. The second, averaging a triple-double for the season, I think is very possible. With those 42, I've written the article, I've referenced it a few times. I wrote an article that basically says if you compare pace between Oscar Robertson time and Russell Westbrook's time, the current era, and then also compare how teams back in the day used to play players a lot more than they do now. And by the way, we are stressing this as kind of a money ball-ish strategy where back in the day, teams would just run out their players. And in modern NBA, they're like, keeping our players healthy for the playoffs for the long run is the wise strategy. The Spurs have done this. You noted everybody on the Spurs plays till they're 40. Even Steve Nash came out and said, hey, D'Antoni really ran the legs off of those Suns teams, ran a very short bench. And even Steve Nash said, hey, maybe a little more rest would have helped me in those playoffs. So bullshit if you thought Russell Westbrook was going to do what he did at the start of the season. It's really, really hard to predict. And so, yeah, just on that note, the reason that came into mind is I made a comment I remember in an early podcast on Chicago, I said it's going to be really obvious by the All-Star break if the Chicago bet was a wise one or a stupid one. And of course, what is Chicago doing? They're waiting till the very, very, very last game of the season to see if we're right or wrong. So that's just a lot of fun in terms of the bets. You can go to the last one. It's 2016-Boxscore Geeks-Portfolio-Update. I can't believe I read out the article URL, Brian. That's so unprofessional. Look in the show notes. It'll be there. But, yeah, you can look over some of Patrick's bets, and he's really, really hoping to come close on a few of them. So we'll see how that comes up, and Patrick will probably write it up. Anything you want to talk playoffs, Brian? The only real note I'd like to add under there is I am really shocked how weak the top of the East is going to be this season in terms of a playoff-worthy team.
Yeah, so this is going to be decided by tomorrow when most people are listening to this. But as of right now, Boston is playing for the number one seed, and we could still hit our under in our portfolio, even if they get the number one seed, I believe. Or if not, they'll push. So the fact that it's that close is kind of surprising.
Yeah, I mean, we're hoping for them to lose. We're hoping for them to lose, and it doesn't matter if Cleveland wins or loses. I think when I checked in last, we're recording this around 9:30 Eastern time. I think Boston looked like they were going to win, so that's just another bet down the drain for Patrick. Way it goes. But by that, what I meant is, if you look at Boston in regards to their players, they are really not what we consider kind of a title-worthy team looking like. This was a theory Arturo brought up back in the day, basically talking about like short benches, where if you examined most playoff teams, come the playoff times, most teams shorten their benches, and as a result, it really boils down to your stars. And I believe kind of the last team that was similar to this, although I'm checking this really quick because I could be wrong, was kind of the Lakers, those 2 seasons they won. But even that's not looking like it. It looks like Pau Gasol was pretty amazing. So I think that's kind of wrong. But basically, the strongest player on the Celtics is Isaiah Thomas right now, who is a 10 wins produced player, which is what I usually use as a star, but doesn't crack 3 points over par per 48 or 200 in the wins per 48 column, which is kind of your star level. So the Celtics, if they take the number one seed, it's going to be one of the weakest number one seeds out of a conference. I actually want to go back and look over that because reviewing the Lakers, yeah, actually Pau Gasol, not necessarily as strong as some other stars, but certainly, 15 wins produced player in 2011 and 2010. So even the Lakers, who were a little less strong at the very, very top as compared to some other teams, were still good. So the Celtics could be one of the weakest number one seeds, and I don't know how I feel about their chances in the playoffs. And obviously the real question is how healthy is Cleveland going to be in the Eastern Conference?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And we've been talking a lot about their defense, actually. There's another article that we didn't quite sneak into the script that was on Nylon Calculus today that I want to say, I can't remember who wrote it, but it was a great kind of season summary of offenses and defenses and how they did in 10-game chunks. And the Cavaliers were very conspicuous at the end. Their defense has kind of gone downhill throughout the season, probably related to injury. But, yeah, I mean, that's what it takes for a team like the Celtics to sneak in there when you have so many stars. One thing I'll say is they do have Jay Crowder, who didn't quite get to 10 wins. He played less minutes than Isaiah Thomas, who was pretty good. But other than that, yeah.
So their top 2 players are Isaiah Thomas and Jay Crowder. Both of these players are basically borderline stars by our number. They're great.
Yeah.
And actually, a player that we had compared Jay Crowder to was Gordon Hayward. I consider Gordon Hayward a max level contract player, but he is not who I want as my top star on a title team. Now, by the way, the Utah Jazz, no problem. They've got Rudy Gobert. Basically, keep Gobert and Hayward on that team and get a.
Oh, we've got Dre's a little bit frozen up here. Let's see if he comes back. Okay, we got you. You're back in real time now.
Oh, I'm just going to turn off my. Okay. I'm turning off my screen, Brian, because we've had that, and I'd much prefer to have audio than that. But all I was going to just note is, yeah, those guys as their top 2 guys don't really live up to some of the other top guys. Kawhi, take your pick of Draymond, Kevin Durant, or Steph Curry. All 3 of those guys are great. Obviously, James Harden, LeBron James. Let's see. I think John Wall's pretty solid. Who on the Wizards is like their top guy? Is it still Wall?
Yeah, although interesting. Oh, so we're going to mention Justin Kabako a little later in the show. Another thing he posted recently was that Brad Beal is one of the few players recently to shoot 60% true shooting and average 22 points per game. So even though he's a very one-sided player, he has definitely picked it up as a scorer this year. Gortat is always good. So, yeah, Washington has some good players.
Washington and Chicago both suffer from their stars aren't quite as good as the others. So if Cleveland, like Cleveland, Miami are healthy, it's not going to be that hard, and especially if they make it to the finals. Now, just the precursor, when we always talk the playoffs, is anything can happen, and injuries, whatever, can change the outcome. We've seen that in finals, right? Despite the fact that the Bulls were the stronger team, Magic Johnson got injured in the 1991 finals, and that was kind of the end of it. Same with James Worthy. James Worthy and LeBron James, or not LeBron James, sorry, very similar players, right? Magic Johnson, LeBron James, both got injured, and that was kind of the end of those Lakers. So anything can happen in the playoffs. All we're saying is some of the top teams out east just do not look like traditional playoff teams in terms of having those one or two star level players. Obviously, for the Raptors, by the way, a huge question is Lowry healthy? Because he's their best player. So
yeah, I think they could even emerge from the East because he's healthy again, and they were pretty good when he was playing earlier in the season. I mean, they're a sleeper.
Yeah. So the East, I said this on last week's show. Who gives a damn about the East?
People who live in the East might.
Well, that's a big part of it. Is the stars are on these low seeded teams. Giannis Antetokounmpo. Hassan Whiteside. These guys are amazing players, but with no real support. So the East is less interesting. The real question is how healthy is Cleveland? But yeah, here's hoping tonight kind of goes our way. Here's hoping Milwaukee can hold on to beat Boston. It basically looks, Cleveland is down 17 points going into the fourth against Toronto. Blowing that 25-point lead really might cost them, though who knows? It's entirely possible that Cleveland just gets to the conference finals and routs Boston, and that the kind of end of the season didn't matter. But whoever makes it to the finals out east is going to have a real hardship on their hands, because between the Rockets, the Spurs, and the Warriors, it's going to be really tough. I don't have too much to say on the next topic, but you got on the script. Definitely just want to shout it out in honor of Russell Westbrook's 42nd triple-double. I really did have to, bring back the Boxscore Geeks Top 10. I forget if it's DG22 or Dodgson. Apologies. I remember
someone with a D at the beginning.
Always gave me crap about how odd it was that the box score, the top 10 box scores of the week really seemed to drop off right as Russell Westbrook's triple-double mania was going on. But yeah, that was a hell of a game to get there. And then, of course, painful for me because, a 30-foot three-pointer at the buzzer knocked the Nuggets out of the playoffs.
Yeah.
There were basically two franchise-setting games. Damian Lillard managed to set a franchise record with 59 points that, basically got a key win against the Jazz. So, the top two box scores of the week were ones that knocked my Nuggets out of the playoffs. That said, I'm still sitting high on the Nuggets. Jokic, we learned pre-show, I've been saying kick at the end. It's kitch. Jokic is just damned amazing, and they just need to get a team around him. I mean, it's actually, if you look at the Nuggets this season, it's damn depressing that they followed a standard Nugget script, which is just underplay a talented big. They've done this with Fareed. They did this with Kufis. They're doing it with Jokic now. If you just give Jokic 30 minutes a game and get a point guard that's not a billion years old like Jameer Nelson or terrible like Emmanuel Mudiay, then this team is a mid-40s win team, if not better. If, they figure out the rotation with, say, Mason Plumlee. Do
you want me to drop that stat on Jokic right now, Dre? I think it's a pretty good time. We've
got
it up right here.
Yeah, let's go for it.
From the teased Justin Kubako on Twitter, he posted today that since Jokic became a full-time starter on December 15th, the Nuggets have been the best offense in the NBA. So that's how good he's been.
This will transition us into our next topic quite nicely, Brian. I've heard a lot of smashing of Jokic on his defense, and there are a few things that bug me. The first is I really hate how often people use the past as a crutch to define what wins in the NBA. And I'm pointing fingers at us, but The reality of basketball is it's very simple, right? You want to outscore your opponent by a good margin, and whatever you need to do that is what you should focus on. Because in the history of the NBA, traditionally teams that win the finals are really good at offense and really good at defense. The Warriors, right, I think are number one in offense this season and number two in defense or something like that. And the reality is that there have been, a team that I love is the 2004 Detroit Pistons that won it all, made it to back-to-back finals, made it to seven consecutive conference finals, I believe. And the reality of that team is that team was basically just defense and middling offense. And so the idea that you can't have an amazing offensive squad be successful in the NBA if they're that good, right? If you give up 10, if you've got a horrible defense but you still outscore your opponent by 10 points a game, you're going to be an amazing team. And so first, I hate the idea when people are like, well, he can't play defense, so don't play him, because for F's sake, if you're one of the top offenses in the NBA, your defense doesn't have to be spectacular. And second, I'm kind of mad because the Nuggets as a whole just kind of suck at defense lately. And that was true before Jokic was getting major minutes. That's true after. Get a decent squad, right? When you get your starting five set, then you can discuss if your defense needs work or not. But the Nuggets, just candidly, with Gallinari and Moutier, are missing two players. They really, really need to replace Moutier and Gallinari from their heavy rotations and minutes. You get me a Nugget squad with a veteran point guard, with Jokic getting full minutes, then we can discuss if defense is a major liability. Until that happens, I'm not really willing to look at it. The reason being, fantastic article at fansided.com this week from, hope I get the name right, Krishna Narsu. And what he discussed is something that I love and I wish more analysts did. Because what he did is he went over defense. He looked, we've talked about this a little in previous weeks where we have all these new stats, contested field goal percentage, how many contested shots people take and how
There's been an update to the Dre metric today, by the way. I just want to point that out.
Anyway.
Sorry, keep going.
So just as a slight tangent there, Dre is a metric that fits into this weird category that doesn't exist anywhere else. I want to stress this. So sorry for the tangent, Brian, but I feel PSA to the internet. There is a lot of use of regression analysis in advanced, I put that in quotes, NBA stats. And indeed, the wins produced statistic is a regression on point margin, which predicts wins, by box score statistics to explain win responsibility among players. A lot of people, and this is the BPM statistic, the Dredge statistic, the Dre statistic, do a regression on another regression. This is the RPM metric, which is a regression on using on-offs, using lineup data versus point margin. So you have this brief period of time, right? With Kawhi and Duncan and three other Spurs on the floor, here's how well the Spurs did, and with them off the court, here's how well they did. Basically, it looks at that lineup, how well that lineup did, who the opposing lineup was, and then how well the point margin was, and tries to do a big regression on that. There are lots of issues with that kind of regression on its own. It doesn't explain very much, et cetera, but I'm going to leave that on the table. But they use RPM, which is a regression already. They do a box score regression on that regression. Doing a regression on a regression is not done by anybody with formal training in this kind of stuff. It's ridiculous. So the reason I said for fuck's sake when Brian said there's been an update to Dre, this is just,
And I said that just to troll you, Dre, so I'm sorry. I apologize.
Oh, troll me, yeah. I brought up, this is the funny part. There are sites like 538 and Fansided, and listeners to the show know that, I'm just not a fan of how they do the work for a majority of basketball statistics. Fansided gets rough because it's a collective of writers. Some of them I love. There are some writers at Fansided that I'm like, this is amazing work. This person is great.
Krishna Narsu, right? This is awesome.
Krishna, yeah. And then there are some writers that I'm like, this is bullshit, and why does this person keep writing? They know who they are. But so I finally brought an article from Fansided that I love, and of course Brian has to come back at me with other articles. So anyway, but basic point, I'm not a fan of the Dre metric, in part because it shares my freaking name, and in part because there's so many things wrong with how that metric is done. You can't even begin to analyze it as a good or bad metric, because you're basically this is built on a bunch of crap. But back to a good analysis that I liked is Krishna goes over all of the contested 3-point field goal percentages and kind of starts talking about if this stat is predictive, and this is huge. This is something that people miss. People miss why we did this with wins produced, and by we I mean Dave Barry. This is all of his research. Dave Barry looked at consistency from year to year, and many people took that to mean the effective way to test a metric is prediction, and that is not what we are saying. The consistency from year to year on statistics like passing, rebounding, blocking, which, by the way, are some of the most consistent statistics in the NBA, versus things like shooting efficiency. Shooting efficiency is all over the place. It's really hard to know year to year how good a player is going to shoot, and a lot of that has to do with like offensive schemes and teammates, right? If you give the ball to James Harden and have him have some three-point shooters along with him, he's going to shoot really well, whereas possibly in a worse offensive scheme, he's going to do worse. It's really hard to predict. The reason we bring that up is to ask, are the stats we are seeing likely skill, meaning you can probably credit the player with them, or luck, meaning that they're out of the player's control and we don't really know? And a good example of this is how good hockey goalies are, because essentially the biggest driving factor in how effective a hockey goalie is shots on goal. And obviously a hockey goalie can't control that. That's up to the defense. So when we're trying to evaluate hockey goalies, it really comes down to who really knows, and most teams are probably overpaying for perceived good goalies, because the reality is the important stat is how many shots on goal happen, and that's more up to the defense than the goalie. And so when Krishna over at Nylon Calculus Fansided is going over three-point defense, what he basically notes is the further away from the hoop you get, the less predictive and, correlated you can really look at in terms of how effective defense is. So, and there, by the way, Andrew Sutton has to love this article. Andrew, if you haven't read it, make sure you read it. But like Andrew was talking about this a few weeks ago when we were talking Kawhi, and it's like, well, if Kawhi is your best defender and you put Kawhi as your best defender on their best offensive player, it's possible that Kawhi just gets lit up because that opposing player is just that damn good. And obviously Kawhi is really good, and that doesn't tend to happen. But regardless, it's really hard to know when I'm looking at a player's stats, are their stats good because the team scheme puts them in favorable matchups so they look good, right? They're the person guarding Ariza, not James Harden. Or do they look bad because, their scheme put them against a good offensive player and they just got outdueled, and vice versa, right? Is it really good offense, or was it just, luck of the draw? Steph Curry, James Harden was cold for the day. And so that's really what this article says. It basically says the further away from the hoop you get, the less consistent, contested defense gets. And I'm going to see if I can get to a quote, because I think I really liked it. Okay, so I want to read the last paragraph. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, where the ads are. So this is a fantastic closing paragraph. Read the whole article if you haven't. So this leaves us where we started. Defense is hard to measure, and the best approach uses multiple statistics and considers the context in which the player is used. However, most of the player tracking defended field goal statistics should be left out of the toolbox of defensive evaluation. And unless you're looking at shots around the basket, the statistics don't show any stability year to year, so it's hard to tease out the signal from the noise. And this
goes Nate Silver.
I really, really wish more people did when they did advanced stats. As I've mentioned, a common issue I've noticed I always say it, if my camera's off, but I always say this with, air quotes or my eyes rolled, the advanced stats community is they hate giving up statistics. The fact that we are still using per as a metric, the fact that I see real GM freaking go MVP candidates by per, it's a bullshit stat. Everybody knows it's a bullshit stat.
And let's talk about the history of per real fast, which we've talked about the show, is that John Hollinger created it years and years ago, sold it to ESPN, then walked away from it, and apparently doesn't even use it in his own evaluations, right?
You can't say for sure that he does or does not use it.
Seems like he doesn't.
When you look at the moves that the Memphis Grizzlies have made, like when he took over the Memphis Grizzlies, one thing he did, this is interesting. I'm offensive enough on Twitter that it might just make sense that he unfollowed me, but John Hollinger briefly followed me on Twitter. Here's what happened though. He traded garbage, Darrell Arthur, terrible player. He traded Darrell Arthur to the Nuggets for Costa Koufos, a player that I loved. Didn't quite work out on the Memphis Grizzlies, injury, all that jazz. That happens. But he traded a garbage player for one of the Nuggets' best players, which is not a per move, so to speak. And that's what we were saying. These moves that Hollinger was making did not really line up with per evaluation. And like I said, he followed me briefly just long enough to basically spite my nuggets and then followed me. But when we talk about the history of per, I'm not mad at per as an attempt, right? This is science, right? I've linked a 5-minute video a lot before where he says, you come up with a theory, you test it. If the test doesn't line up with reality, you throw it out. That's the problem with the advanced stats community. The adjusted plus minus, real plus minus, the plus minus statistics. When this data became available, so in 2001, play-by-play data became available, and a lot of people started using it for plus minus statistics, on-off statistics to look at stuff. A lot of the initial work on it was basically noise. The adjusted plus minus metrics that like Wayne Winston and Dan Rosenbaum back in the day started with explained like 15% of the data. That's nothing. And you can't really tease it, right? Even there, it's really hard to get the sample sizes enough. We've talked lineup data forever. You can go to Basketball Reference for any team and look up lineup data. And you will notice that there are lineups that, play less than 2 games together. And you can't, we've seen 2-game stretches where LeBron James looks horrible, and then we've seen 10-game stretches where LeBron James looks like the next. Actually, he's LeBron James. He's on his own. I've said this before. He is the best modern NBA player in the history of the NBA. I don't know why I added the modern. He is the best player in the history of the contemporary NBA. I'm going to call that shot clock era on. LeBron James is the best. But so when you have like 2 games of data on players or 2 games of players on lineups or whatever, it doesn't mean anything. So. But the problem is you have this statistic that people were convinced meant something, and they've dug this gigantic rabbit hole, right? They did plus minus. That's not enough. They did adjusted plus minus. They did regularized plus minus. They've done their own variants of it. And they're so far gone. And really the reality is to say this is interesting data, doesn't mean anything. And it's not even to say it's not important. You can just hit a point where you say, I am not able to use this data for anything meaningful. If I give you $2,000 in gift cards to some store that you will never shop at, have no use for, and can't resell the experience, right, Brian? This is like the sunk cost fallacy. Let's say I gave $1,000 of non-transferable. What's an activity you hate but others might enjoy?
Oh God, you're putting me on the spot.
Rock climbing. Here's a good one. My wife. If you gave my wife $2,000 in non-transferable, skydiving to like jump out of a plane.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't skydive either.
She would the best move for her is to say, I'm never going to do this. I can't get any money back from this. I just need to throw this coupon out. It's no good. And that's why I love the end of this article is to say, we have this new statistic. It seems like it should be important, but examining it on its own, you got to throw it out. If you can't improve this, you got to leave it alone. And the same basically would have been my take on a lot of the plus minus statistics, to say, without using other data, this stuff doesn't really mean anything. And even then, this is very noisy. Leave it alone. And that's not what we've done. So that's why I'm happy here, because the right analysis is often to say, what can we say? And that happens all the time on this show, right? You are. I love you so much as a Golden State Warriors fan, because after years of doing this, the Warriors win 3 games. I go, how you feeling? You're like, it doesn't mean anything. Warriors lose 3 games. I go, how you feeling? Doesn't mean anything. You have basically learned that without having a large sample of games to really know if a player is healthy or injured, if a player is back or not, that basically the wisest move is just stay the course. And that's worked out really well, with the exclusion of LeBron James being the kryptonite to the Warriors being what they should be.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Well, I don't want to dig into the Warriors, but I do have some complaints about their lineups, and they just kind of keep going out there. So we'll talk about that on a different show. My last thing on this, though, is the analysis that you're referencing about the Spurs defense and Kawhi Leonard that is also linked in this Krishna Narsi article. It was written by Matt Moore. So, most people have probably read that by now. But, yeah, that was an article that a lot of people referenced this season.
I still don't know on that because, right, the argument of that one was that defenses were neutral, or offenses were neutralizing Kawhi by having their best offensive player kind of draw Kawhi out. And Patrick, as a coach, went, well, if you neutralize their best offensive player, in theory, that should be fine. And for what it's worth, right? If unless something major changed, which, is possible, because I think the Spurs hit the point where they knew their seed and haven't cared as much in recent games. But I believe the Spurs are the number 1 defense. Yeah, they're the top defense in the NBA. So it's a weird thing to me to say the Spurs, they figured out Kawhi, so they neutralized the Spurs defense, when the reality is the Spurs have the best defense in the NBA. This season has been interesting. This season has seen, I'm not ready to believe that the analytics movement is catching on, but Morey ball seems to be catching on. Teams are shooting more from three than they ever have. Teams are shooting better from free throw than they ever have. So it's a slight tilt. So it's interesting because, right, if you look at just surface level, the Spurs defense, if you're talking points that they give up per 100 possession, is worse than last season. But if you look at them relatively, they're better than last season. Because I think last season they were second, or actually they were first both years. So anyway, I was just going to say, basically the Spurs maintain their lead in defense in the NBA. It just might not appear as obvious because there's kind of been inflation in the NBA in terms of points scored. And the problem is people aren't necessarily going to look at that analysis, right? There are times where a player might, this was what you were talking about, Steph Curry a week ago or 2 weeks ago.
I've looked into this since then, by the way, but go ahead, yeah.
I might put you on the spot for that.
I'll talk about that.
But so basically, Steph Curry had a press conference and was talking about the MVP and how he's worse than last season. Now, the numbers bear this out, and I'll kind of say kind of, my dogs may not agree, in that I recall looking at Steph Curry at the beginning of the season. He was kind of really bad. He had a really weak start. And there are lots of reasons, right? He maybe was still recovering from injury from last season, maybe getting used to Kevin Durant in the lineup, whatever. He didn't start well, but, he's ended the season as, a top 10 player in the league, if I recall, according to our numbers?
Yeah, his last 15 or so games have been ridiculous. He's been like 50% from three and just really kicking ass.
Okay, so it may be the case that, if he says, I'm not worse than last season, well, that's not true from an aggregate, but, if we're saying, Steph Curry, yeah, so he's top 20, but still amazing. And if you're saying his top 15 games, he looks like last season. But he was just saying, my points per game are just down. And that's what's fooling you, right? You're looking at totals, you're not looking at other stuff. So to that point with the Spurs, everybody's points are up, so the Spurs look different than last season. But if you look at their rank defense-wise, they're still just as good at defense. So that was an interesting article to me to say, teams have figured out Kawhi. Well, if they figured out Kawhi, but the Spurs still have the best defense in the league, have they really figured him out?
Yeah, and that's why that was a subtle article. I don't think he was trying to say that he was a bad defender or they're a bad defense because of it. I think it was more of, like the Deion Sanders or Darrelle Revis argument where you just put him out on an island and no one even throws there, right? It was one of those kind of things. So, yeah, anyway, yeah, it was good to see that kind of analysis. But I can talk about Curry real fast because I didn't find enough there for an article. So maybe I can just go through it real fast on the show. But yeah, so what happened with Curry is basically, that's the one thing he said is, I'm just taking less shots this year, which is true. And also he said, I'm just missing shots. I'm not playing any worse at all. And, I'll be fine. And that I'm still confident I'm one of the best players, which you need to be, right? It's good to be that way. So I looked into it and I mostly agree with him. So he's shooting worse from two than he was last year, but better than any of his previous seasons from two. He's just not shooting very well from three, though. He's at something like 41%, and in
that's
the past,
so nuts to say that, by the way.
But he's been up 45 or more in the past.
That is a bad. And by the way, this is the worst season. That is so damned remarkable, Brian. 41.2% from three is his, and how many threes he's taken? He's
300
taking
something, 310.
Which
is second of all time in attempts next to himself last year.
He's taking 14 threes per 48 minutes, which, as you mentioned, is huge, shooting 41%, and that's his worst season. That is freaking ridiculous in terms of how good he is.
Yeah, so last year he had a career high in rebounding as well. He's down this year. That's hard to keep up. I mean, he's still a very good rebounder for a point guard, and he's, been pretty good at it still. And looking into, so it's really just, he's taking less shots and shooting worse than last year. And isn't really a real reason I could find for that. He's shooting less at the rim than he did before, but he's shooting more from three. So I think that kind of balances out. He's taking more 3 to 10 foot shots, which is bad because he only shoots 40% from there. That's not a good range to shoot from. Not really taking any other bad mid-range shots, though. And I also looked at contested shots. His shots are actually less contested this season than they were last season. So I agree with Steph Curry. Really, it's just regression to the mean, which for him is very, very good.
And then also, I mean, if to accommodate Durant, he takes a couple fewer shots or when you talk shots at the rim, well, I could completely buy if you've got Steph Curry, who's, a 7-footer, and he is 7 feet tall, on your team. maybe let that guy drive to the rim instead of, Steph Curry, who's tiny with, the surprising part about Steph Curry is relative. Most NBA players have a big wingspan. Steph Curry does not, which makes him even more remarkable to me.
He pulls rebounds sometimes where I can't even see him, like he's covered behind all these big players. But anyway, we got a lot of stuff to get through still. So let's see. Where do you want to go next? Do you want to do jerseys real fast, or did you have anything else on that one?
We can give Curry some credit there. Curry is the top-selling jersey in the NBA.
Oh, that's true. Good segue.
I think says a lot about having a good team in Golden State. I think going to San Francisco is just a good move for them. You want them in a big market. The only kind of what I'll put as interesting and just a note is Russell Westbrook just had a historic season. Kawhi is an MVP candidate, and these two players still don't track the top three. And, I think it says a lot to market size. And I still get into the stupid market argument where I don't necessarily see the good of having the best players in the NBA in crappy markets. I don't see the purpose of having, NBA teams in crappy markets. It says something at Kristaps Porzingis. I don't care what people say. He's not having a great season. The fact that he's seventh, and that's just because, he's in the New York market. The one shout out I'll give is I am damned impressed that being in Milwaukee, he's a damn good candidate. I'm damned impressed that Giannis made the top 10. All the other names, nothing really surprised me. It's either a combination of big market really or MVP candidate player. So,
and look at all these Warriors and Cavaliers on there, though. My takeaway was just that winning sells, and you just want to win, and someone on your team's going to get credit for it.
That has always been the case, although I do believe Rodney Fort has talked about this before, where I think jersey sales are one of those split revenue streams. So it's kind of an interesting one where I don't think there's necessarily a win for, Curry doesn't get a bonus from being the highest jersey seller as far as I know. So is what it is.
True.
He
re-upped with Under Armour though, I think, so he'll be in good shape.
That's an amazing pickup by Under Armour, although he might be, he's probably past, he's probably in his prime. So they have him at the right time, but if they resign him to another contract, that could be expensive. I did not do least valuable. You mentioned this on Reddit. There was a least valuable player discussion. I just think Moutier sucks, really. Like Moutier cost the Nuggets a playoff spot. I mean, early in the season, I said Moutier had cost the Nuggets 5 games if he had just been replaced by an average NBA player, average point guard. And that had to have just gotten worse as the season went on. So Moutier is my guy. Anything you want to comment on, either this thread or what we would say?
Yeah, I'll give credit. I found this on our NBA subreddit. Xandrick Ellison was the original poster. And it wasn't too interesting, any of the people they had. But what this got me looking at is who are the actual least valuable players? Like, who has the most negative wins? Which, that stuff matters, right? So the example I always use is last season – the Warriors had this guy, Spates, who was just one of the worst players in the league, and he was so bad that he negated all this good production they had. So getting rid of him, I mean, it's a huge exaggeration to say that was as big as picking up Kevin Durant, because obviously it's not. But it's an underrated thing to get these bad players off your roster. So who are these guys? I was curious who they were, and we do have this up right here. Actually, one of the guys that we loved in college, who had great college numbers, Sabonis on OKC, who got to play quite a few minutes this season. He had the most negative wins produced in the league this year, unfortunately. And it was all young guys, pretty much. Young guys on teams that aren't contending, saying, okay, we're just going to run you out there and let you do whatever you want. Booker with the 70-point game, we were going back and forth on him. I think you convinced me in the end that was a good game, so I was probably wrong about that. But Booker himself, third most negative player in the league this year. Saric is on the list as well. People are saying he's going to be Rookie of the Year. No, he's one of the worst players in the league.
If Russell Westbrook and Dario Saric make MVP and Rookie of the Year respectively, it'll be like the most inefficient shooters to take those awards relative to league average. It'll be amazing.
I do want to note that Carmelo Anthony snuck into the top 10 too. I guess, sorry, Carmelo.
So they're two interesting notes. So here's what I'll say. First off, they use per, which I'm never a fan of. But the funny note, I've noted this about per, which is the issue with per is it really doesn't credit the bad stuff enough, right? It doesn't look at missed shots enough. So if you have a really crappy per, odds are, unless you're a really, really efficient shooter, you're not a good player. And I believe all of these players, I'm looking at this list, none of these players are players we like. But Yeah, it's the same point I just made, right? People still use per, can't do anything about it. Way it goes.
The biggest lesson is young players are just not that good usually, and if you can get a young player that's productive, like both of the Hernan Gomez's, especially Willie, they're both really good or kind of average, I guess. But that's as good as it gets, having an average young player usually.
Well, and typically teams that end up with stars, the funny part is they're usually wasted, right? The players that tend to be great, Andre Drummond, Jokic, for
Kevin
instance,
Love, when he was on the Timberwolves, is the big example.
they've inexplicably all been on really bad teams. I mean, Jokic was a second rounder, so in theory could have been on a good team, but I think it's usually hard to get a really good young player on a team that is good that will also give them a lot of play. I think, obviously, I think like Tim Duncan's the last real major example of that, and that's forever ago. So is what it
It's
is. I mean, Kawhi kind of, but Kawhi, the Spurs, as I've noted, are very patient with young players. They don't push them out, and I really, really do wonder about that hindering development. I really do wonder if Moutier could have been a productive NBA player and just playing him 30 minutes a game and giving him 10 plus shots a game. That's just a horrible, horrible strategy to do for, a 19-year-old player on a team that's not going to make the playoffs.
I just want to say it's amazing that the Nuggets have the best offense for most of the season, considering, I guess they didn't give him a ton of minutes. They gave him like kind of mediocre minutes, but quite a few minutes.
It's next season. They just need to give him 30 plus minutes and get a reasonable point guard. That's really it. If they can go get Rubio. I saw at the trade deadline, there was some discussion they were going after Butler. I keep hearing George rumblings too. I really hope not. Paul George, all the potential in the world, look great younger, but I just do not buy he's bounced back from his injury. Somebody was throwing out Otto Porter. I think that could have just been, just a what if scenario. But if the Nuggets are smart, they're one or two players away from being great. I say that not ironically. I truly believe it. And, Arturo is a big Boston Celtics fan, so I have all the feels in the world for being super optimistic on a team right on the precipice of the next step, because like Boston has been there forever, right?
They just need one star, right? That's it.
Not even one star. I mean, I would love to see Boston win a title with like 200 wins produced players.
Oh,
but
that'd be fun.
I think I think they're one player away. And Al Horford wasn't the right move. I just have one last kind of point. This was maybe going to be an article this week, and I just got behind. But first off, I want to bring up just a shout out to a great book called Console Wars by Blake J. Harris. He does a lot of the research for the How Did This Get Made podcast. If you can't find it on Amazon, Brian, don't worry about it, but I'll try and include a link in the show notes. It's a great book on the history of Sega and Nintendo, and it's fantastic. And the NBA MVP reminds me a lot of just not that book, but the premise of Console Wars. So for those that are older and possibly younger people, it might still apply. There was like an era where you were like a Nintendo person or a Sega person, and you were just convinced that your system was the best because it used to be back in the day, there were a lot more exclusive video game titles to a system. Nintendo, to a degree, still keeps this, right? The newest Link game is only going to be on the Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Wii U. But, back in the day, it was very much the case where there were games that were only on the Nintendo or only on Sega. So, and these were very expensive purchases, right? With inflation, video games have not really gone up in price. The Nintendo and Sega Genesis way back in the day, relative to modern days, were made more expensive. So if you were a kid, you could probably only afford one of these if you were lucky enough to afford one. And so you had to convince yourself the Sega Genesis is the best system. Sega is better than Nintendo. Nintendo, or if you're a Nintendo person, Nintendo is better than Sega. And the companies, that's why this book, Console Wars, is great, because it plays into that. It plays into the marketing that went behind how much Nintendo and Sega really marketed themselves and were how adversarial and how mean and how they were tearing each other down and influenced lots of other stuff. The MVP has turned into that for me because a few weeks ago, my point was I don't give a damn who wins because obviously Gobert's not going to get any love. Rudy Gobert would be my choice. But outside of that, all of the other candidates, Russell Westbrook, James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, LeBron James, any of these players that wins MVP, and those, by the way, those are the only four players that stand a shot. And I think LeBron James is unfortunately out of it with just how bad how bad the Cavs played out the remainder of the NBA season. But any of those players win it, I don't care. Russell Westbrook put up a historic season. He's a top 10 wins producer. Hell yeah, would break the mold of giving the MVP to a player on a team with over 50 3 wins. Kawhi, we've loved him forever. Top 10 NBA player, would love him to get MVP. LeBron James, greatest modern NBA player, as we've said, would love him to get MVP. James Harden, he's a fantastic player, top 10 wins producer on a great team. We'd love him to get MVP. It is impossible for me to be mad at who wins the MVP, but I'm looking at Twitter and people are fighting, and it feels so much like the console wars. And my basic point is, it's just funny because the problem is there's only one award. I actually will credit football a lot, not football, baseball a lot with this. In baseball, there are 2 leagues, and they basically give out an award for pitcher and hitter. And then they also have like gold gloves and stuff. So baseball kind of understands just there are so many players that do things that deserve being considered the best that they give out multiple awards. They give out 2 Cy Youngs, right? If I'm not mistaken, Brian, they give out 2 MVPs. The NBA has had 1 MVP when it had, 8 teams in the league. It's had 1 MVP when it's got 30 teams in the league. And we've talked about this issue before where the NBA has the best of the best of the best players in the world, right? I worked at one of the most prestigious software firms in the world, and it had 30,000 employees when I was hired. The NBA in its history has had fewer than 5,000 players and like fewer than 2,000 starters. So the real issue with the MVP is not that any one of these players deserves the MVP that much more than the rest. To the same kind of point we were talking earlier about noise, when players get good enough, even if our numbers say definitively, if our numbers say Rudy Gobert is better than James Harden or DeAndre Jordan, fine, but it's close enough where there's a margin of error where I could give it to either player. All of the players in the MVP race, to me, are close enough that it's a margin of error, and I shrug my shoulders at it. I don't care. So that's just kind of the point, that sports is a very weird world where you can have the top 0.001% in the world at something and argue about who's better. And it's a very warped, weird world. And I figured I'd at least point that out because I was noticing that on Twitter with people going, how dare Russell Westbrook, Dean Oliver came out of retirement to post a post on why Russell Westbrook doesn't deserve an MVP because he's shooting inefficiently. By the way, I've got basketball and paper on my freaking shelf behind me, Dean, and you said people that said Allen Iverson didn't deserve the MVP back in 2001 didn't deserve it, and basically you told them to shut up in the book, so you can shut up because essentially both Russell Westbrook and Allen Iverson are like exactly league average at true shooting percentage. So if you didn't have a problem, Dean, with Allen Iverson winning the MVP and you put that on paper, and now you're going to come out and say Russell Westbrook doesn't deserve it because he's an inefficient shooter, whatever. But yeah, I've just, shrugged my shoulders at all of these MVP arguments against each other because my honest response is any of the players that has a legitimate shot of winning MVP, any of the players that ends up top 4 in voting, any one of them can win and I don't have a problem. That's where I'm at.
Sounds reasonable, but it should be Gobert, right? Come on, let's go Rudy.
I think Gobert should get some love, and Gobert is just another example to me that's indicative of, there has not been an advanced stats revolution, because even the arguments that I see regularly show up, it's just people look for arguments to justify their own preconceived notions of who is a good player. And so defense forever was a common cop-out for a lot of metrics like the wins produced statistic that would say these players are good because they go, well, what doesn't it factor in, right? Oh, it doesn't factor in team defense. So ergo, players that are really good perimeter defenders are really good, players like Embiid. That was what I was hearing a lot of people. When I said Jokic was a better player than Embiid, that was what they came back with. Well, what about his defense? So Gobert is a player, though, that there aren't any outs left, right? He's an amazing defender on one of the best defensive teams in the NBA. He's amazing at offense, albeit limitedly. So he's just an example to me that until players like that get the respect, and I mentioned this, I still don't remember the player, Brian, even though I've said this before. There was a Cy Young winner in baseball that got it on a team with like a mediocre record. Until the NBA has a case like that, and even Westbrook's not going to count because he leads the NBA in points per game. Until the NBA has that kind of change, I'm just not going to believe that the analytics revolution is taking over. That's just where we're at.
Yeah, that's right. I'm with you.
All right. Well, I'm not ashamed of this at all, Brian. I wanted to get us through here in fewer than 45 minutes, and we're gonna be really close. So I'm okay taking us to shoutouts. I have one. We already mentioned one of yours, which was Justin Kupatko for the fantastic statistic on Nikola Jokic. Do you have any other shoutouts?
No, that's it. That's the only one I got. Other than you, Andrew, Patrick, all the commenters. It's been a good NBA season. Our last show of the regular season. Time for the playoffs.
season's playoffs are, let's hoping that the Warriors get one more win this year than they did last year in the playoffs. You're gonna feel bad you didn't get this shout out, Brian. It's actually kind of a sad one. I
Oh.
gotta give a shout out to Charlie Murphy.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Died of
Charlie
cancer
Murphy,
in his 50s. Man, that's sad.
it. I mean, obviously he was fantastic on the Chappelle show. The Prince basketball and pancakes sketch is perhaps one of the greatest in modern sketch comedy history, and it is so damn tragic that both Prince and Charlie Murphy aren't around anymore.
Oh,
That is
and
that
there,
is
I want to say, Dre, there's been reporting since interviewing all the people that were allegedly there that played in that game that was written about in the joke. Supposedly, it was accurate. Everything that happened in the joke really happened. So there you go.
I think what Prince said is he said he didn't make the pancakes, of course, but yes, he did. They did eat pancakes when they were done. And then, it is true. Prince, there are photos of him playing basketball. Prince was a really good basketball player.
He's a college player.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he played in college, even though he was well under 6 feet tall.
And then what I was also just going to note is, he ended up using the Dave Chappelle dressed as Prince as one of his album covers. I mean, that's too soon on all those people, just way too soon. So anyway, that's my shout out. Sorry to end on a down note. This has been the Boxscore Geeks show. If you found us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. You can find us on iTunes and Stitcher, the Boxscore Geeks show. Subscribe, upvote, helps us out. We go live every week, twitch.tv/nerd numbers, usually 9:30 p.m. Looking like Wednesdays tend to be our day. So 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, usually Wednesdays, sometimes Tuesdays if we're lucky, Thursdays if we're running behind. If you missed the live show, you can catch us on channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube. I've been your host, Dre Alvarez. You can find me on Twitter as Nerd Numbers, produced, co-host, all hats, as I mentioned, Boxscore Brian on Twitter, Brian Foster. Thanks so much, and we will see you next week.